Dennis thought this would be just like any other day. He packed up his hunting gear and headed to the Amazon rainforest, where he'd hunted many times before. But no one could have prepared him for what he was about to discover today. He looked around, hunting for prey, when he suddenly saw a huge animal moving in the distance. At first, he was excited. What great luck to stumble upon a huge catch so early on in his hunting trip! But then he realized there was something strange about it. This was something he had never seen before. Dennis lives near the Amazon rainforest in Brazil and often goes hunting there. He hunts for armadillos, capybaras, and slasher deer. He then sells his catches or eats them. He used to go hunting with his father and now does it on his own. Dennis has a strict area where he always goes hunting. He knows he always comes back with at least 1 or 2 catches. But today, he decided to go somewhere else. There's a reason why he was drawn to this new area, as it turns out. What is it that's caught his attention? Dennis had thought of a simple solution to finding his way back. He tied little strings around a few trees. He hadn't been to this particular part of the forest before, so this way he would know where to go back to. After walking for 20 minutes, he stopped and hid behind a tree. There he waited until an animal appeared. Suddenly, Dennis notices 2 yellow eyes looking straight at him from a tree. He knows exactly what that means, a jaguar. He slowly steps backwards, but hears a rustle in the leaves. This startles him, and he begins to run away, not looking at the strings anymore. Not the smartest move in a giant rainforest. After Dennis had run a few meters, he stopped and began to pant heavily. It was at the time he stopped running that it dawned on him that the animal wasn't after him all along. At the place Dennis stopped, there was no sign of the string trail he had tied to trees earlier. He began to wonder about how he would find a way out of the forest. Dennis became worried as it was getting late. The last thing he wanted to do was to spend the night in the Amazon rainforest. While thinking of the best way to get out of the forest, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. Almost at the same time, everything turned black. Could he have been injured somewhere along the way? After about an hour, which to Dennis seemed like a second, he woke up. He couldn't believe that he had slept. As his eyes got clearer and he tried to look around, Dennis was startled by what he saw. As he tried to get up slowly, he touched his head and felt a big painful bump. Luckily for Dennis, he saw a familiar string, and with it, he got back to his trail. Carefully, he followed the strings and arrived back at his car. He heaved a heavy sigh of relief on seeing his car, and with a grateful heart, he drove home. To his greatest surprise, he woke up the following day with a great headache and still feeling curious about what had happened the day before. There were still so many questions in his mind. Dennis needed answers. As soon as Dennis got to the forest, he got his gear out of the car trunk and began his journey. Dennis tried to follow the same string trail he had made the day before, but got stuck while following it. While trying to find his way, a random thought popped into his mind. After about 30 minutes of walking on the path, he turned around and realized he was totally lost again. As he was contemplating whether to go back or continue his journey, he heard a loud rustle in the bushes. Dennis became more frightened when he remembered he was all alone in the forest. Suddenly, he began questioning if he made the right decision. As Dennis watched closely, he saw that the animal stood on 2 legs but wasn't entirely straight. He also realized that it had hair all over its body. Quickly, he took a picture, but at the same instant, he realized that picture looked photoshopped. Based on his realization, he began to think of better ways to prove what he saw to his colleagues. Even though Dennis was a hunter, he wasn't heartless, so killing the animal wasn't a good choice for him. He made a sound that wasn't so loud and stopped to see if the animal heard it. Keeping in mind that he was also still vulnerable and exposed, he tried to go as quietly as possible. Dennis had to be strategic about it. Luckily for Dennis, at the slight sound, the animal turned around and stood with its back turned towards him. At this thought, he jumped up and shot a dart right in the animal's butt cheek. It was now or never. Dennis watched carefully as the animal collapsed to the ground with a loud thud. Once he was sure that the animal was completely asleep, he walked over to it, and without really looking at it, Dennis grabbed its legs and began to drag it through the forest. He had to stop a few times because it was exhausting work, but he also knew that he had to act fast before the creature woke up. He's used this tranquilizer before, but never on a creature like this. He didn't know how well or for how long it would work. Finally, Dennis reached the edge of the forest. To his surprise, he wasn't where he'd started. He could see his truck in the distance, but he had wandered farther north. He needed to get the creature to his truck somehow. Dennis decided that he had no other choice. He left the creature for a few moments to run to his truck, covering it up with leaves and branches before doing so. The animal was big and difficult to drag through the forest, but to Dennis' surprise, it was easier to lift than expected. Once he had the creature in the back of the truck, he sat down and thought about what to do next. Dennis decided that he couldn't take the creature to a veterinarian. They would want to keep the creature for themselves and claim the discovery. Lucky for Dennis, his brother-in-law was a doctor. Dennis drove off toward the lab where his brother-in-law, Connor, worked. He had to think of a way to tell Connor about what had happened. He didn't want to scare him away. The door opened, and on the other side was Dennis' brother-in-law. He was angry. "Dennis, what the hell are you doing here?" "Connor," Dennis answered, "I have something amazing. I need you to look it for me." Connor looked at the creature with confusion and amazement. Luckily, the animal was still asleep in the back of Dennis' truck. Dennis asked Connor to at least take a DNA sample for some tests so they could identify exactly what the creature was. Connor hesitated a little, but soon he said yes. He was just as curious as Dennis was. He knew the creature was going to wake up, and he didn't feel right about putting another tranquilizing dart in it. After all, 2 was probably already too much. With no better options, Dennis drove home and put his truck inside the garage. He bound the creature to his truck more tightly and waited for his brother-in-law to call. Connor took his appointments, but also made time to test the DNA. He was incredibly curious and looked at the results between seeing patients. But as he read the results, he turned pale and was met with more questions, such as, "How is this possible?" Connor immediately called Dennis and told him the results. Dennis was in shock when he heard the results of the DNA test, but he also knew exactly what he had to do. Dennis quickly got back in his truck and drove back to the forest where he'd originally been. Time was not on his side. Connor tried to call him a few more times, but Dennis knew what Connor would do if he got hold of him. He would want the creature back to be studied 24/7 by a team of scientists and doctors. Once back in the forest, Dennis untied the creature and checked to make sure it was still asleep. It was. Dennis quickly left the creature and watched from a distance as it stood up. It looked bewildered and disoriented. Nevertheless, Dennis knew he had made the right decision as he watched it walk deeper and deeper into the forest and out of sight. But Connor still wanted answers. Dennis came out of the forest and finally answered the phone. Connor yelled at him saying, "You need to bring him to me immediately." Connor frantically explained that he had let the creature go back into the forest. "But he is human," Connor yelled. Dennis froze in shock. This was definitely farthest from what he expected from the results. A million thoughts suddenly flashed in his head. The creature he had just left in the wild turned out to be human? Dennis hung up on his brother-in-law and returned to his car. He needed to get away from here before someone noticed. As soon as Connor told him that the DNA results had come back human, Dennis knew that he needed to let the man go back to his home in the forest. It was not up to him what would be best for the creature man. As for Dennis, he stopped hunting in that part of the forest. He knew that Connor or others may try to follow him and get their creature back. The man was never seen again. Dennis made it his mission to protect the forest and the people within it, especially from people like his brother-in-law. This whole experience taught him the lesson of the importance of not meddling in the affairs of the wild.